They mocked the Apache woman until the rancher roared, "Touch them and the town will burn." The sun was beginning to sink behind the distant hills, casting long, golden shadows across the dusty streets of the small town. The air was dry, filled with the faint scent of hay from the ranches and the distant sound of cattle lowing. Townsfolk were finishing their daily routines, some gathering in front of the general store, others riding home after a long day of work. The streets were calm, almost quiet, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity and gossip that lingered in the air. Into this quiet town came a new face, a woman with proud eyes and graceful movement. She was an Apache woman, carrying herself with dignity, though the weight of past experiences showed in the slight furrow of her brow. Her name was Aylin, and she had come with her young son and a small bundle of belongings, seeking a fresh start in a place far from the hardships and judgments she had known before. Her arrival did not go unnoticed. Some watched her with polite curiosity, but others with whispers and sideways glances, their words carrying a sting of old prejudice. Aylin tried to ignore the quiet judgments. She focused on finding a place for her family, a home that would shelter them from harsh eyes and harsher words. She had been through too much to let fear control her. Though the tension in the town was palpable, she carried herself with patience, moving steadily from one task to another, aware of the unspoken scrutiny that followed her. At the market, Aylin carefully chose fresh vegetables and a few small items for her home. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, but the whispers started almost immediately. "Look at her," one woman murmured, clutching her basket a little tighter. "Doesn't she belong somewhere else?" "She's different," another man muttered under his breath. "Not like us." Aylin heard them, though she did not respond. She had learned long ago that arguing with ignorance rarely brought peace. She smiled faintly to herself, telling her son to stay close, to focus on the tomatoes rather than the stairs. Her heart beat a little faster, but she maintained her calm exterior. From a distance, the rancher watched. His name was Matthew, a man whose presence carried quiet authority in the town. He was respected for his fairness and feared for his strength, though he rarely sought attention. He noticed the glances and heard the murmurs, and something stirred in him. He had seen prejudice before, had seen it cause unnecessary pain, and he could not stand to watch it unfold before his eyes, especially toward someone who carried herself with such quiet dignity. The whispers grew louder as a few men approached Aylin. They smirked, making jokes meant to unsettle her, their words sharp and cutting, though not violent. They mocked her clothing, her accent, the way she carried herself. Her son clutched her hand, looking up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. Aylin paused, kneeling to adjust his hat, and whispering something to him that only he could hear. He nodded, though his small hands trembled slightly. She straightened, her chin held high, her eyes steady. She would not let them see her fear. Matthew moved closer, though still a distance away. He watched how the townsfolk circled, how their laughter was crueler than the words themselves. He could feel the tension building, a sense that if no one intervened, things could escalate. But he knew that rushing in too soon might provoke more than he could control. One of the men, bolder than the others, stepped in front of Aylin, blocking her path. "Don't you know this isn't your place?" he sneered. "You should go back where you came from." The words were sharp, but Aylin did not flinch. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder and said in a calm, steady voice, "I am here because this is the place I chose. My son and I have the right to live our lives in peace, just like everyone else." The man laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "Right, huh? You don't belong here. You'll never fit in." Aylin's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "Fitting in is not my goal," she said softly. respect is. A hush fell over the small crowd of onlookers. Her words, though simple, carried weight. There was a quiet dignity in her voice that seemed to cut through the shallow mockery of the townsfolk. Some averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the truth, while others whispered angrily among themselves, unwilling to accept it. Matthew's hand rested lightly on the reins of his horse. He knew he had to act, though he wanted to give reason a chance to prevail first. His gaze swept over the gathering, noting the mixture of fear, curiosity, and defiance in the crowd. He could sense that the tension was on the verge of spilling over, and he made the decision to intervene before it did. But before he could step forward, Aelin's son, brave despite his small size, spoke up. "Leave my mother alone," he said, his voice small but firm. "She didn't do anything to you." The bullies sneered, looking down at the boy. One of them reached out a hand as if to push him, but Aelin stepped in quickly, placing herself between her son and the man. Her eyes blazed, a quiet fire that told the man he had gone too far. Matthew finally moved forward, walking steadily toward the group. The crowd seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, and they parted slightly, giving him space. He stopped a few feet from the bullies and spoke, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made people turn their heads. "Is this how we treat people in this town?" he asked, with mockery, fear, and cruelty. Look at her son. They are here to live like the rest of us. Is that so wrong?" Some of the men laughed nervously, others shuffled their feet, unsure how to respond. Matthew continued, his gaze sharp, scanning each face. "You think this is just harmless teasing, but it is not. It is disrespect, and this town will not stand for it." Aelin's heart raced, not from fear, but from relief. She had endured much, and the presence of someone willing to stand up for justice gave her hope. Her son clung to her hand, his eyes wide, seeing a protector in Matthew as she did. The bullies hesitated, sensing the shift in the crowd. The townsfolk, who had earlier whispered quietly to each other, now watched openly. Some nodded subtly at Matthew, showing silent support, while others avoided his gaze, realizing that their actions were not going unnoticed. Matthew's voice grew firmer, carrying through the quiet street. "I will not allow anyone to harm this woman or her child, and anyone who tries will answer not just to me, but to this town." The tension was thick, but there was no immediate violence. The bullies exchanged glances, unsure whether to retreat or escalate. Matthew remained calm, his presence steady and commanding. The quiet authority in his stance spoke louder than any words could. Aelin, feeling the weight of the moment, straightened. She did not speak, but the fire in her eyes reflected the determination that had carried her through countless struggles. She knew that Matthew's intervention might be the turning point, but she also knew that strength came not just from others, but from within. The sun dipped lower, painting the town in shades of orange and gold. Shadows stretched across the streets, and the market emptied slowly as people went home. But the moment lingered, a silent understanding that the town's equilibrium had shifted. The Apache woman and her son were no longer just outsiders. They were people whose dignity demanded respect. As Matthew mounted his horse to leave, he glanced at Aelin. "Stay strong," he said quietly. "You're not alone here." Aelin nodded, a small, grateful smile crossing her face. Her son tugged gently at her sleeve, and she bent down to whisper to him, "We will be safe." "We are not alone anymore." The bullies lingered for a moment, uncertain and quiet, then slowly dispersed. The town had witnessed the event, and word would travel quickly. Some would side with justice, others would carry resentment, but the seed of change had been planted. Aelin and her son walked home, their steps lighter than before, their hearts buoyed by the knowledge that courage and respect could not be silenced. And in the quiet of the fading day, a sense of hope settled over them, fragile but real, like the first breeze of spring after a long winter. Even as the sun disappeared behind the hills, casting the town into twilight, one truth remained clear. No act of cruelty could extinguish the light of dignity, and some voices, when spoken with courage, could change the course of many lives. And far off near the edge of the town, Matthew watched as they walked, knowing that the quiet fight for respect had only just begun. The next morning the town was quiet, almost deceptively peaceful. The sun rose over the hills, spilling warm light across the dusty streets and wooden buildings. Birds chirped in the trees near the edges of town, but beneath the calm surface, tension simmered. Word of yesterday's incident had spread quickly. The market's whispers from the day before had become conversations, and those who had not been present were now eager to form opinions. Eileen moved carefully through the streets, her son holding her hand tightly. Their home was modest, a small, well-kept cabin on the edge of town near the ranches, but it was enough to give them shelter. Every step they took was measured, each glance around them alert, though her chin remained high. She had learned long ago that living with dignity required courage, even in the face of people who did not understand. Not all the townsfolk approved of her presence, and some were bold enough to show it. A group of men gathered near the general store, whispering and laughing under their breath. Their eyes followed her as she passed, their expressions unreadable but heavy with judgment. Eileen's son, only 7, tugged at her sleeve. "Mother, why are they staring at us?" he asked softly. She knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Because some people are afraid of what they don't understand," she said quietly. "But we will not let that fear decide how we live our lives." They continued on, the weight of the town's scrutiny heavy, yet invisible to anyone who did not pay close attention. Some merchants avoided her eyes entirely, pretending she was invisible, while others gave small, careful nods, silently offering support. Eileen noticed them, appreciating their quiet solidarity, even though it was subtle. By mid-morning, the group of men who had mocked her the day before had grown bolder. They started spreading stories meant to humiliate her, exaggerating her words and actions in the market. Rumors traveled fast in small towns, and soon whispers became questions, and questions became complaints to the town council. Some townsfolk wondered if the woman had any place here at all. It was then that Matthew, the rancher, decided it was time to intervene more directly. He had watched from his ranch over the past days, observing how the town's prejudice slowly tried to push Eileen and her son to the edge. He knew that gentle words alone would not stop the harassment. Firm action was necessary. He rode into town that afternoon, his horse's hooves kicking up dust that glimmered in the sunlight. People stepped aside automatically, not because they feared him personally, but because he carried a presence that demanded respect. Even those who had tried to oppose him in small arguments before now kept their distance. Matthew found Eileen at the edge of the town square, carefully carrying a basket of food from the market. Her son trailed behind, his eyes alert, scanning the crowd. The same group of men who had mocked her yesterday had gathered again, this time in greater numbers. Their laughter carried across the street, cutting through the soft murmurs of the market. Matthew dismounted, the leather of his boots crunching against the dry ground. He walked steadily toward the group, his eyes calm but unyielding. "I believe some of you have been spreading stories about this woman and her son," he said, his voice clear and steady. "What is it you hope to gain by mocking someone who means no harm?" The men paused, uncertain how to respond. Some tried to laugh it off, shrugging their shoulders, but Matthew's calm intensity made the attempt awkward. He continued, "This town stands on respect. That includes respect for every person who lives here, regardless of where they come from. Is that so difficult to understand? It stepped forward, trying to assert himself. We're just talking, he said, his tone forced. It's none of your business what we say. When your words threaten the peace of this town and the safety of a family, it becomes everyone's business, he said. You need to stop. Aylin watched from behind, her heart beating fast. She had hoped for help, but the sight of Matthew stepping so firmly into the situation brought relief and courage at the same time. Her son squeezed her hand, as if he too could feel the weight of someone standing up for them. The men laughed nervously, trying to regain control of the moment. "And if we don't?" one of them asked, his voice sharp. Matthew's gaze did not waver. "Then you will answer to the law, and you will answer to this town," he said. "I will not stand by while you spread lies and make people afraid of living their lives in peace. Leave them alone, or you will face the consequences." A hush fell over the square. The townsfolk watched silently, sensing that something had shifted. The bullies, who had once felt untouchable, were now faced with a man whose presence alone demanded caution. Aylin's son, emboldened by the rancher's intervention, spoke up again. "Mother doesn't deserve to be treated like this," he said. "She works hard. She's kind. Why would anyone make fun of her?" Matthew smiled slightly at the boy. "You're right," he said, "and anyone who forgets that will be reminded." The bullies hesitated, unsure how far they could push. The moral weight of Matthew's words, combined with the growing attention of the townsfolk, created a tension that was almost tangible. They had expected Aylin to be intimidated, to retreat in fear, but the combination of her dignity, her son's courage, and the rancher's authority made them second-guess their actions. For the next few days, Matthew made his presence in the town more noticeable, not through intimidation, but through consistent support. He visited the market, helped neighbors, and quietly showed that he was watching over Aylin and her son. The town began to take notice. Not everyone, but enough people to start shifting the dynamics. Some residents quietly expressed support for Aylin, offering help with supplies or simple words of kindness. Others, who had tried to provoke her, were more cautious, no longer certain if their words would go unnoticed. Aylin felt a mix of relief and cautious optimism. She continued her daily routines, tending her small garden, preparing meals, and teaching her son to read and write. Yet she remained alert, knowing that prejudice often took time to disappear completely. She appreciated Matthew's support, but understood that her own courage was equally important. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent behind the hills, the same group of men attempted to approach her again. This time, they whispered to each other, clearly planning something. Aylin felt her pulse quicken, but did not show fear. She turned to Matthew, who had arrived quietly on his horse, as if anticipating trouble. "You again," one of the men muttered, trying to sound casual. "You think you can stop us?" Matthew dismounted slowly, his eyes steady and unflinching. "I don't think," he said. "I know. And this town will not allow anyone to harm this woman or her child." The tension was thick, almost suffocating. People passing by slowed, sensing the confrontation. The men realized they were no longer in control. Matthew's calm authority made the bullies' laughter fade, replaced by uneasy shuffling. Aylin took a deep breath, feeling a strength that came from within. She stepped slightly forward, placing herself in the middle of the group, her son close at her side. "You will not frighten us," she said firmly. "We have the right to live in this town just like you." The combination of her courage and Matthew's steady presence was overwhelming. The bullies faltered, their plan dissolving in the face of resolve they had not anticipated. Slowly, one by one, they backed away, muttering excuses, and left the square. Matthew turned to Aylin, nodding slightly. "You see," he said, Courage matters, and when people stand together, injustice cannot thrive. Island smiled faintly, a quiet warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in us." Matthew tipped his hat. "You only need to believe in yourselves," he said. "I'm just here to remind everyone else what respect looks like." The townsfolk watched as he mounted his horse and rode off toward the edge of town, leaving a sense of calm in his wake. Aylin and her son walked home, their steps lighter than they had been in days. The small victories mattered. Each act of courage, each refusal to bow to cruelty, made the town a little brighter, a little fairer. By evening, a few neighbors came by to offer simple greetings, small acts of kindness that spoke volumes. The town was beginning to shift, slowly but surely. The presence of someone willing to stand up against prejudice had encouraged others to examine their own behavior. Aylin tucked her son into bed that night, listening to the quiet sounds of the town settling into darkness. She felt a sense of cautious hope, knowing that the days ahead would still bring challenges, but also knowing that they were no longer alone. Courage had taken root, and with it, the possibility of change. Outside, Matthew looked back toward the town from the ridge near his ranch. He could see the cabin where Aylin and her son lived. The shadows of the evening stretched across the land, but his heart felt light. He knew that true change required patience, but he also knew that when people stood together for what was right, even a small town could begin to heal. And in that quiet moment, as the stars began to appear one by one in the sky, a sense of calm determination settled over the town. Aylin's family would face challenges, yes, but they would face them with courage, dignity, and the knowledge that there were people willing to stand with them. The story of yesterday's confrontation had already begun to spread, and the lesson was clear. Fear could be met with courage, cruelty with strength, and prejudice with unwavering dignity. And that was only the beginning. The days that followed were a mixture of calm and quiet tension. The town had begun to settle into its routines, but there were still whispers, glances, and occasional cold shoulders aimed at Aylin and her son. The bullies, although hesitant after Matthew's intervention, had not fully disappeared. Small provocations, careless comments, and mocking jokes still lingered in the background. It was a subtle kind of harassment, the sort that gnawed at one's sense of belonging, and Aylin felt it deeply. Despite this, she remained determined. Each morning she walked through the streets with her son, carrying herself with quiet confidence. She tended to her small garden, taught her son reading and writing, and began to build connections with those in town who were willing to offer kindness. Slowly, she could sense that some of the townsfolk were beginning to notice her strength, her patience, and her dignity. A few smiled as she passed, offered a polite greeting, or helped her with small favors, like carrying water from the well. These gestures, though small, were a balm to the quiet wounds of prejudice. Yet the bullies had not given up. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, a larger group gathered near the town square. They whispered to one another, laughing softly but with a cruel undertone, plotting something they believed would frighten Aylin and remind the town that she was different. They approached the square with casual confidence, their eyes fixed on her and her son as she walked home from the market with a basket of fresh bread. Aylin noticed them immediately. Her hand tightened over her son's small fingers. "Stay close to me," she whispered. Her voice was calm, but her eyes reflected a quiet readiness. She had endured enough to know that courage was often tested repeatedly. From a distance, Matthew was already on his horse, having been tipped off by a neighbor who had seen the group forming. His movements were quiet but deliberate as he rode toward the town square, dust rising in the golden light. He knew that these men were looking for an opportunity to provoke, to humiliate, and possibly to assert a false sense of control. He could not allow that to happen, not now, not ever. The bullies stepped closer, one of them smirking and trying to appear bold. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for nearby townsfolk to hear. "Looks like the woman thinks she belongs here. Does she think the town has forgotten who she is?" Island lifted her chin, her gaze steady. "I belong here because I live here," she said simply. "No one else decides that for me." The man laughed, a sharp, cruel sound meant to unsettle her. "You think words like that matter?" he sneered. "You're just a stranger. No one will defend you." Island's son stepped slightly forward, his small chest puffed up with courage. "My mother is strong," he said firmly, "and she has people who care about her." The bullies glanced at one another, a flicker of uncertainty passing through the group. Matthew arrived at that moment, dismounting with a calm precision that drew the attention of everyone in the square. His presence alone changed the energy of the crowd. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the dusty street. "This town does not stand for cruelty, mockery, or fear. You have tested patience enough." The men sneered, trying to regain confidence, but Matthew's steady gaze made them falter. He continued, "You think that standing together gives you power over others. It does not. Respect and decency are what give strength to a community, not ridicule." One of the bullies, bolder than the rest, stepped forward, trying to challenge him. "And if we ignore you?" he asked. "If we decide to keep doing what we want?" Matthew's voice hardened, though he did not raise it. "Then you will face consequences. Not just from me, but from every person in this town who values justice. Harassing a family will not be tolerated. And I promise you, any further attempts will not go unnoticed." For a moment the square was completely silent. The tension was palpable, thick in the air. The bullies glanced at each other, realizing that they were no longer untouchable. Their smirks faded, replaced by hesitation and unease. Island felt a wave of relief mixed with gratitude. She had known Matthew's presence would help, but she also recognized the importance of standing firm herself. She straightened, her eyes meeting those of the bullies. "We will live here," she said, voice steady, "and we will do so with dignity. You cannot take that from us." The men hesitated. They had expected fear, perhaps even submission. Instead, they were met with quiet courage from a woman and her son, and firm authority from a man who would not let injustice pass. Slowly they backed away, muttering under their breath, their plan having failed. The townsfolk, who had been watching from a distance, now approached more openly. Some offered nods of encouragement to Island and her son. Others gave small words of support. The presence of allies, however quiet, made a difference. The town was beginning to recognize that courage and fairness could not be ignored. Later that evening, Aileen sat outside her cabin, watching the sky turn from gold to deep purple. Her son played nearby, laughing quietly as he built small towers of stones, his imagination unhindered by the weight of the day. Island's heart was full of a quiet pride. They had endured, they had stood firm, and they had gained allies. But she also knew the challenges were not over. Prejudice, once planted, was slow to fade. It required patience, consistency, and courage. Matthew arrived at her cabin as the last light of day disappeared behind the hills. He approached calmly, leaving his horse tied near the fence. "The men have been quiet today," he said. "I watch them. They are hesitant now, unsure if they can continue. But it's not over yet. Some of them will test boundaries again." Island nodded. "We are ready," she said. "We will not back down." Matthew smiled slightly. "Good. Courage must be met with courage, or it will fade. You've shown that. Your son has shown that. And together, You've reminded this town that dignity cannot be ignored." The next few days were a mix of normal life and careful observation. Eileen went about her tasks, tending her garden, baking bread, and helping neighbors when she could. Matthew continued to be a quiet but visible protector, making rounds in town, offering help to those in need, and ensuring that the message was clear: harassment would not be tolerated. Still, tension occasionally flickered. Some townsfolk, those who clung stubbornly to old prejudices, whispered among themselves, hoping to find new ways to intimidate or provoke. But their attempts were cautious now, measured against the knowledge that the town had started to change. They could no longer act openly without consequence. One afternoon, as Aylin and her son walked to fetch water from the well, a small group of children approached. They were the children of some of the townsfolk who had been hesitant in their support. "We heard what you said the other day," one of them said shyly. "You were brave. We wanted to tell you, we think you're right." Aylin smiled, kneeling to meet their eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "Courage is not about never being afraid. It's about standing up, even when you are." The children nodded, then ran off to play. Aylin watched them go, feeling a warmth that spread through her chest. Small victories, small acts of acknowledgement, were what built lasting change. That evening, Matthew joined her again at the cabin. They sat quietly, watching the stars appear one by one. "They will test you again," he said, voice calm. "But each time they do, they remind the town who they are and who we are. Courage cannot be hidden and justice cannot be ignored." Eileen nodded, thinking of her son. "He's learning," she said, "and I hope the town is learning too." Matthew's eyes reflected the fading light. "They are, slowly but surely. The town is remembering that dignity and respect are stronger than fear and cruelty." In the days that followed, the bullies' efforts to intimidate Eileen and her son became weaker. They tried small comments, but the townsfolk's quiet support, combined with Matthew's consistent presence, made them hesitate. The town began to see that standing with what is right was not only necessary, but powerful. Eileen continued her life, each day building her place in the town with quiet determination. Her son grew braver, learning that courage and respect were not just words, but actions. And in the distance, the hills held the promise of another day, another chance to show that dignity could not be shaken, that prejudice could be challenged, and that even in a small town, courage could inspire change. By the time the sun set on the week, the square no longer felt like a place of tension. The market had resumed its normal chatter, and Eileen could move through the streets without constant fear. The bullies, now more subdued, had been reminded that the town would not tolerate cruelty. Matthew watched from his ranch, satisfied that the town was shifting, that the family he had quietly protected was finding their place. It was not the end of challenges, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. Courage had been met with courage, respect with respect, and slowly, quietly, the town began to change. The following week dawned bright and clear, with a gentle breeze sweeping through the town, carrying the faint smell of hay and earth. Life seemed to return to a rhythm, yet the memory of past tension lingered in quiet corners, reminding everyone that change required vigilance. For Aylin and her son, each morning began with hope, tempered by awareness that not everyone had accepted them fully. But they moved forward, each step a small act of courage and dignity. Aylin tended her garden early, her son nearby, carefully planting small herbs and vegetables. The garden was more than food. It was a symbol of stability, growth, and a life taking root in a town that had once felt uncertain and unwelcoming. As she worked, neighbors who had once avoided her smiled politely, offering soft greetings. A few brought extra seeds or shared tips on tending the soil. These small acts of kindness, subtle yet meaningful, warmed Aylin's heart. Matthew appeared mid-morning, riding slowly through the dusty streets, his eyes scanning the town. He had been keeping watch discreetly, knowing that the bullies might test their limits once more. But he also knew that sometimes the best way to teach courage was to let people act on their own, to show strength through choice rather than confrontation. That afternoon, the town square became the center of attention once more, though this time the atmosphere was different. A few of the men who had mocked Aylin previously approached, but there was hesitation in their steps. They no longer had the confidence to intimidate openly. The townsfolk watched from doorways and windows, curious about what would happen next. One man, the boldest of the group, stepped forward and cleared his throat. We were wrong," he said slowly, almost reluctantly. "We didn't treat you fairly." Aylin looked at him carefully, noting the sincerity, or at least the attempt at it, in his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice calm. "It takes courage to admit a mistake. I hope you mean it." The man nodded, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. "I do," he said. We want to make things right." Matthew stepped forward, his presence still commanding, though his tone was gentle. "Making things right begins with respect," he said. "Respect for her, her son, and for the town itself. Words are a start, but actions matter more." The other men exchanged uneasy glances. They were not used to accountability. The townsfolk, sensing that a turning point had arrived, began to step closer, silently showing their support for Aylin and her family. It was a quiet but powerful shift. The community was witnessing the balance of justice tipping toward fairness and respect. One by one, the men offered apologies, simple words acknowledging the harm they had caused. Some hesitated, caught between pride and the need to change. But Aylin's calm acceptance made it easier. She nodded to each of them in turn, her dignity unwavering. "We can move forward," she said, "but let it be with honesty and respect." The square, once a place of fear and tension, began to feel lighter. Children played nearby, watching the adults with curiosity, and even the animals seemed to sense the change, wandering freely without the unease that had accompanied previous confrontations. The town had begun to heal, though the work was not yet complete. That evening, Matthew rode by Aylin's cabin again. He dismounted and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. "They've begun to understand," he said. "But remember, real respect takes time. They will need to see it reflected every day." Aylin smiled faintly. "We are ready for that," she said. "We will live with courage and show them the right way." The following days were filled with small but meaningful changes. The bullies, now cautious, began to act differently. They helped at the market, carried water for neighbors, and slowly, through consistent behavior, began to regain a measure of trust. Their mockery and cruelty faded, replaced by a careful attempt to fit into the new rhythm of the town. Some were still awkward, learning how to interact with honesty rather than prejudice, but their efforts mattered. Neighbors who had been hesitant began to take more active roles in the community. They greeted Aylin and her son openly, offered help with chores, and invited them to local gatherings. Each gesture, however small, reinforced the growing sense that this town was capable of change. One afternoon, the town council called a meeting in the square. Residents gathered, a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism in the air. Matthew stood near the edge of the crowd, his eyes scanning for signs of trouble, though he sensed that the town had begun to embrace a new respect. Aylin and her son arrived together. Their presence was no longer questioned. They had become part of the town's fabric through patience, courage, and consistent dignity. When the council opened the floor for discussion, a few of the formerly hostile men spoke up first. They acknowledged the mistakes of the past, shared lessons learned, and expressed a desire to build a more inclusive community. Eileen listened, her eyes calm, her posture proud. Well, when it was her turn, she spoke simply, but with conviction. "We all have a chance to do better," she said. "To respect one another, to care for one another, and to recognize the strength in every person. I came here seeking a home, and I have found hope. I hope we can build a town where everyone feels safe and valued." A quiet murmur of approval passed through the crowd. Some nodded, others whispered agreements, and a few smiled openly. It was a moment of acknowledgement, not just for Eileen, but for the town itself. They were learning to redefine themselves, to leave behind old prejudices and embrace fairness and compassion. Matthew stepped forward as well, offering a brief word of guidance. "True strength is not in fear, nor in the power to hurt others," he said. "It is in courage, honesty, and respect. This town has a chance to lead by example, to show that dignity and justice are stronger than cruelty. Stand by that, every day." The message settled over the crowd. Some had needed to hear it spoken aloud. Others already understood but found renewed courage to act. The atmosphere, once tense and hostile, felt lighter, warmer, as if the town itself had breathed a sigh of relief. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Eileen sat on her porch with her son, watching the town prepare for night. Children ran freely, neighbors waved, and the streets felt calm in a way they had not for a long time. The Apache woman allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She had endured challenges, faced mockery, and remained steadfast. Now she could see the beginnings of acceptance and understanding. Her son leaned against her shoulder. "Mother, do you think they will be kind to us now?" he asked, his voice soft. Eileen kissed the top of his head. "Yes," she said. "It will take time, but they are learning, and we will continue to show them the right way." Matthew appeared once more, riding slowly past the cabin. He stopped, tipping his hat in quiet acknowledgement. "You have done well," he said. "The town is better because of your courage, and it will continue to improve because you have shown them what is right." Eileen nodded, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in us when it mattered most." "The strength was always yours," he said. "I only reminded them." The night settled in, cool and peaceful. Stars began to shine above, twinkling in the clear sky. Eileen and her son went inside, their hearts lighter than they had been in weeks. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been meaningful. They had faced prejudice, stood their ground, and inspired change in those around them. Over the following weeks, the town continued to evolve. Small gestures of respect became habits. Children played together, neighbors helped one another, and the former bullies gradually became allies, learning through action what it meant to treat others with dignity. The Apache woman and her son were no longer outsiders. They were part of a community that had learned an important lesson about courage, respect, and fairness. Matthew watched from his ranch, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He knew that true change was slow and required effort, but he could see the difference. The town had shifted, not because of fear, but because of courage, honesty, and integrity. Eileen had stood tall, her son had learned to be brave, and together they had taught a town the value of respect. And so, the small town settled into a new rhythm, one built on trust, understanding, and kindness. The Apache woman and her son thrived, their home a place of warmth and safety. The townsfolk, once hesitant, had embraced a new standard of behavior, guided by example and the reminder that courage and dignity were more powerful than cruelty. As the sun rose the next morning, casting its golden light over the town, Aelin and her son stepped outside. They breathed in the fresh air, feeling hope and possibility with every step. The future was theirs to shape, and the town had begun to follow their example. Together they had faced fear, overcome prejudice, and found a place of acceptance in a world that had once seemed uncertain. And far off at the edge of the hills, Matthew watched silently, knowing that justice and courage had prevailed. The town would never forget the lesson, that dignity cannot be silenced, that prejudice can be overcome, and that standing together with courage and integrity could change lives forever.